I'm Edward Shelswell White, and this is the Signal Report for April 2025. We believe recession in the second quarter, i.e., this quarter, is the most likely scenario absent quick and significant permanent reversal of tariff policy. Now, tariffs aren't the sole cause of why we think there's going to be a recession, but they are likely to push us over the line. The three largest segments of US GDP in descending order are consumer spending, government spending, and manufacturing. Consumer spending has been under pressure for some time, and we all know what's happening with government spending. Tariffs will tend to harm manufacturing, and so we think with that pressure on the third largest segment of the economy being added to the first two, that a recession is almost inevitable. To add to that is uncertainty. The administration has been delaying and changing the magnitude of the tariffs that it's going to levy on certain goods, but this isn't necessarily better than a unfavorable certainty, because in the face of uncertainty, businesses tend to sideline their major decisions, and that tends to lead then to a slowdown in the economy. Plus, consumer expectations, as we've talked about, on both the economy and inflation are troubling. Let's walk through a couple of these real quickly. First, we can see that in the current data, we really don't see an indication that the economy is entering recession, but we think that's because the data lag reality significantly enough not to show up yet. The Wall Street Journal wrote this article that you can see here on the screen in mid-April, talking about how the current indicators are very much indistinguishable from those in the Biden administration. But again, they feel, as do we, that the lag between the headlines and the data is the key reason for that. But the reason we think that these lags will start to show up primarily is looking at what's happening with consumers. Consumer expectations here that we measure using the University of Michigan monthly consumer sentiment survey. Consumer expectations are falling now at a rate 13% steeper than they did in 2020. And these tend to be a self-fulfilling prophecy because consumers changed behavior today in anticipation of a tougher tomorrow. So if they think tomorrow is going to be bad, they tend to start spending less. They pull back their purchases of major things and travel and so forth. And they tend to be then sort of a self-fulfilling prophecy. The current expectations in the 5 months since their November peak over here are actually dropping at a rate faster and a slope steeper than the first 5 months of COVID, after which, by the way, in the 6 months, consumer expectations ticked up. So this downward trend ended after 5 months. We don't believe this one will. So we expect the current trend not only not to end, but also to be steeper and longer than the one that we witnessed in COVID. Likewise, consumers' inflation expectations tend to be self-fulfilling. Consumers tend to accelerate purchases even though they are bearish about the future. If they feel that inflation is in the offing, they tend to accelerate purchases of things they believe they have to buy anyway in order to get ahead of the curve, if you will. And that tends to drive up prices and contribute to inflation. Current expectations are the steepest slope in either direction of the last 10 years, will almost certainly pressure inflation up and reduce, if not eliminate, in our opinion, any chance of a Fed rate cut this year. Depending on the rate of inflation, we think we could see Fed rate increases this year. We actually put those odds at greater than 50-50 starting in June or July. And if a recession does occur, then we're looking at stagflation, a term that we thought had been really relegated to the history books treatment of the 1970s, but that is now a real possibility. We, along with most analysts looking at the industry, we had expected the industry to have a strong year this year with regulatory and merger policies more favorable than the previous administrations. While those two things are true, their merger and regulatory policies probably are more favorable. The macroeconomic issues have overtaken that. The expectation of a good year is really now out the window. Despite the preponderance of green arrows on the dashboard here, every red arrow pretty much has a green arrow offsetting it. CASM's up, but RASM's up more. ASMs are down, but operating profit margin is up. By the way, that's not a coincidence. That's a feature, not a bug, of how airlines plan. But basically, the future view is dimmed, and airlines are already acting minimally, we think, to curtail exposure. We look for more dramatic reductions in the weeks ahead, excuse me. This is the most uncertainty airlines have faced absent a black swan event, certainly in my career. COVID, 9/11, the great global financial crisis, all sort of black swan events. But United, for instance, everybody I think knows this, is offering two sets of guidance for the remainder of the year, one with a recession tilt and the other without. Other airlines have suspended guidance. Airlines are reducing capacity by roughly 4% on average in the second half of the year. But we think that's just getting started. And by the way, it's also just a continuation of a trend that's been in evidence now for over 30 years, since early in the first Clinton administration. US airline operating revenues as a percentage of GDP have been declining for some time. Early on, this was because of reduced average fares. And since the global financial crisis, it's been because of a reduction in capacity relative to GDP. So we expect that trend not only to continue, but to accelerate. And part of the reason is that, as we can see here, investors are going to force airline leaders to make radical changes. This graph shows the airline stock performance since the day before the election versus the S&P 500. The S&P is down, call it 3%. The best performing airline stock is down 8.6. That's Southwest. But all of them are down. They got off to a pretty good start, but you can see when tariffs started to become a real thing and the view of the economy changed, you can see how much of a beating airline stocks have taken. And their investors are going to force them to make change in order to first stanch the bleeding and then reverse the flow. Some examples of what radical change would look like are here. I won't read them all, but they would go from network design changes to fleet adjustments. When all else fails, mergers and alliances, those are signs of airlines being out of better ideas. Not to say that they're bad ideas, we don't mean that. But that means they're out of ideas to improve their profitability and their performance internally, and they're having to look to external things. So we know, for instance, that JetBlue and United are rumored to be exploring an alliance, maybe in three parts. Again, it's probably not the last one we're going to see as an indicative of how out of other ideas airlines are, but they will tend to then come down to things like fleet adjustments. United has already early retired 21, I think so far, unnamed aircraft. We expect other airlines probably to follow suit in the weeks and months ahead. And then network redesign. When a carrier can't figure out how to make its network work, it will look to do one of three things. It will look to cut unprofitable flying from its network. It will look to make the cities that remain on the network more profitable. And then it will look to grow opportunities to add new service that it can be profitable right away. But those are an increasing order of difficulty. So look for more unprofitable cutting or flying to be cut from airlines networks in the weeks and months ahead, and unless they have either strategic benefit or a clear path to profitability. An example of that, by the way, this is an anonymized airport, but we track every quarter. We track profitability at the route level at each airport using DOT DB1B, T100, Form 41, and Form 127. And we allocate costs and revenues the way that an airline would to each route in order to come up with a fairly accurate assessment of how profitable each route is. And this is a medium hub airport with the profitability of the 7 routes flown by a major carrier for the last 4 quarters. And you can see here that it's not very profitable. In fact, what we call this here, we call this the Mississippi graph because the outline of the route profitability looks a lot like the outline of the state of Mississippi. This is an airport ripe for capacity reduction by this carrier. Of the 7 routes they flew in this airport on a daily or better basis last year, 2 of them were point-to-point, 5 were to hubs. Not one was profitable. And overall, this airport is a significant drag on this carrier's network profitability. So absent a quick turnaround or strategic benefit, we would expect to see this carrier reduce the amount of point-to-point flying it does here and reduce the number of hubs it serves here in an attempt to retain as much network traffic as possible while reducing its cost. This is just one example, but it represents the choices airlines face in trying to make their networks more profitable. And it illustrates the challenges airports have because airlines do not share this kind of intel with them. We are talking about what we refer to as the information or intelligence asymmetry between airlines and airports. Airlines have all the information, airports don't have any, and yet airlines are looking to airports to make them more profitable, but they're not giving them the tools they need. Airports either have to get this intel on their own, such as buy a product like our Epic product shown here, or they're going to have to fly blind. And if you don't have to fly blind, why would you? That's it for the April 2025 version of the Signal Report. Tune in next month when we have updated version for May 2025, where we help you find the signal noise.